So what I'd like you to do is to think back to when you were a student, when you were starting your undergraduate career and you were assigned a personal tutor. What were your expectations of that? When I think back to my own situation when I was starting out as an undergraduate, I was expecting my personal tutor to be someone who would motivate me, inspire me, but be my pathway into the profession, someone who could show me the ropes and lead me into the discipline and the profession that I was pursuing. A recent survey of students asked the question, what do you value in your personal tutor? And the kind of things that came up from this, where students were saying things like, well, we really value having an expert to guide us, having someone who would look out for our progression and have a one-to-one opportunity for one-to-one meetings, and someone who would also be someone there who could be our point of contact for the discipline. And this really distills down into the student looking for a sense of belonging, being accepted, or a sense of fitting into the organisation, the institution and the discipline. The same survey asked the question, what do students least value about personal tutoring? And what came up were things like students didn't appreciate the fact that it was a bit of a tick box exercise, that they felt that it was impersonal, and they also felt that the staff, their tutors were too busy to see them and were therefore uninterested. So it seems that a sense of belonging is really important for students. And how do we get that? How do tutors start to encourage students or build into them a sense of belonging? And it comes from students being able to identify with or relate to their tutors and for the students to feel valued. So how can a tutor relate to their tutees? Well, you don't have to look like your students, you don't have to talk or act like them. It doesn't mean you've got to spend more time with them, but it does mean you've got to rethink how you use the time with them to make it most effective. And I think about, for my time as a personal tutor, my objective was to be as effective as possible in terms of being high on impact and high on efficiency in terms of minimising the time it spent, but also maximising the impact that I had. And therefore, what makes sense here is to encourage students to become independent learners, to take responsibility for their own development. And if they can do this, then that means you can hand over the progression to them to take care of, and all you're doing is then becoming a facilitator in that process. So this needs personal tutors to take a mentoring approach. And if they take a mentoring approach, in other words, getting students to help themselves, this meets the objectives of the tutor for being effective, but it also meets the student's objective for belonging. So let's take a look at what's involved in a mentoring approach. To make it as succinct as possible, we can look at a mentoring approach in basically 3 stages. The first stage is we need to be good listeners, and there's a technique called empathetic listening that I'll describe to you. Secondly, we need to ask questions, but we need to ask questions that add value. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And finally, we need an approach or a framework to steer us or guide us in the mentoring process. So let's talk about empathetic listening. This comes from Stephen Covey's excellent book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And empathetic listening is not listening just for the facts, but it's listening for the person. In other words, we're trying to understand the facts and the emotional content. So it requires us to put our own agenda to one side and to focus our interest on the speaker. But we've got to be genuine in this. If we fake it, it'll come across as not being genuine. So we've got to have a genuine interest in the person. It's important we don't judge, because as soon as we start judging and making judgmental comments, then that's going to close the person down. They're going to stop exploring things. It's important that we don't jump into advising. If we start advising, first of all, we may not be giving them the right advice. We may not be advising them the best thing to do because it's based on our perception of what the situation is. Secondly, if we start advising, what happens is we're creating dependence when that person starts depending on us rather than encouraging people to be independent. So try to avoid the temptation to advise. And finally, don't assume that you know the answer, or you assume you know what's going on, because you probably are going to get it wrong. And so finally, in empathetic listening, it's important to reflect back what you hear and understand before you respond. So empathetic listening is very important for building trust. And the theme really of empathetic listening is just by the act of listening, you are valuing people, you're making them feel valued, and often because you're creating space for them to think into, that's often a way of helping them solve their own problems. So the second component of taking a mentoring approach is asking questions that add value. So we're not just asking questions for the sake of it, we're asking questions that really give traction to the student to help them make some sense out of the situation. So we as academics need to move from telling to asking. So we're moving modes now into adopting an asking approach. And it's important to use open questions which help people explore. And by open questions, these are questions that don't just need a yes or no answer. So we'd start our question by asking things like who or what or when or where or how and maybe why. So let's have an example. So maybe a student comes to you and says, oh, I'm really struggling with poor exam technique. So an example of a question that doesn't add value would be something like, well, do you prepare adequately? Well, that, first of all, it's a closed question, just requires a yes or no answer, but also doesn't necessarily move the student forward. Whereas if we would ask a question like, well, what's going on for you when you sit in the exam hall? That's exploring the situation and helping the student process that. And then we could ask something like, well, what do you think you should be doing differently? Or how might you be more prepared for the exam? These are open questions to help the student reflect on the situation and generate some ideas. So finally, the third component of mentoring would be to use a framework or an approach. There are many approaches and frameworks available to us. A very useful one and accessible one is something called the skilled helper model, which was proposed by a man called Gerard Egan. And Egan's skilled helper model has got 3 stages. It's got, first of all, we look at the current picture and we ask the question, what's going on? Then we move forward to the preferred picture, which is, well, what does good look like? Where do you want to get to? And then once we've got that difference between, well, what the current situation is and where do you want to get to, we ask the question, well, how might you get there, or what's the way forward? And just using this framework is very powerful, and it gives a sense of, okay, helping us to locate the student in the particular situation, and what's going on, whether it's poor exam technique or wanting to move into a certain career or change course or whatever the situation is. And then you're helping the student to explore the preferred picture, what does good look like in terms of exam performance or future career or whatever it is they're interested in, and then helping them determine a way forward or create a plan on how they might move from where they are to where they want to get to. So let's summarize what we've been talking about. The student has got an objective to have a sense of belonging to the institution, to the discipline, or to the profession. But the tutor's got an objective to be effective in what they do in terms of having an impact and also being efficient. So both objectives, we said, can be met if we adopt a mentoring approach to our personal tutoring. And we said that a mentoring approach involves careful listening, or empathetic listening. It involves asking questions that add value. And it helps if we've got some sort of framework to guide us in this, like the skilled helper model. But overall, really, it requires academics to move away from the traditional lecturing skills that they've honed, which involves telling, and to adopt a new skill set of mentoring, which is more about facilitating people, helping people to help themselves. So finally, it requires the tutor to move away from relying on traditional lecturing skills of telling and to adopt the new skill set of mentoring or thinking like a facilitator. But the bottom line is this needs to be fueled by a genuine interest in the student for it to be effective.